can get started. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this AAM workshop focused on pressure campaigning and animal testing with our very, very special guest speaker who we have today, Amy Meyer. Before I introduce you all to our guest speaker, I just want to remind everybody that this workshop is brought to you by Animal Activism Mentorship and will also be recorded and posted on YouTube, so we're recording. AAM is a free global organization focused on empowering humans and vegans with the tools, skills, knowledge, and confidence necessary to start speaking up for animals whenever and wherever you can. So you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can follow us on YouTube at Animal Liberation Action Squad, which is the channel that this video is going to be posted on. And you can sign up for the mentorship program at animalactivismmentorship.com. Now, I am very, very excited to introduce to you all our guest speaker for today, Amy Meyer. Amy is the Director of Grassroots Organizing at Rise for Animals. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Rise for Animals. She became a grassroots activist in 2005, and together with other activists and organizations has led several very successful pressure campaigns, including banning horse-drawn carriages from the streets of Salt Lake City, Utah, defeating Utah's ag-gag laws, and effectively ending pound seizure in Utah. For those of you all who don't know, pound seizure is where animal testing facilities will go to animal shelters and buy the unclaimed or unadopted animals and begin testing medications, cosmetics, what have you on them. So it's pretty terrible industry. So thank you, Amy, so much for the work you've accomplished there for the animals. So with that introduction, I'm sure I don't have to tell y'all that we are all going to learn so much from Amy here today. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and Amy, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peyton. It's really awesome to be here with everyone and to see some familiar faces and names and then a lot of new folks too. So really excited you're here. While I get this PowerPoint here set up and going, I would love for people, if you haven't already put in the chat where you live, that's super helpful. I would also love for people to just put in the chat what kind of activism you do in your community. So just whatever that is, I would love to see what people are doing across the country and maybe even across the world. Maybe there's some folks from other countries here too today. So add that in the chat while I get this set up here. All right. Yes. Awesome. Someone from the UK. So I want to say up front that the information I'm sharing about animals and labs is specific to the United States, but a lot of things happen very similarly in other countries. And certainly when we discuss the ways that animals are failing as models of research, that's also relevant for folks in other areas. Awesome. Thanks, Debbie, for adding in what kind of activism you do. So lots of different tactics here, social media, protest, outreach, and Eli Lilly protest. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much. Keep adding them in. I'm going to kind of keep half an eye on the chat to see what kind of activism y'all are doing, or if you're not active yet, if you're just getting started with this and getting mentored, I'd love to even see what kind of activism you want to be doing. And hopefully we'll be able to focus on some helpful things when we start talking about our campaigns. So today I'm going to first go into animal testing and really try to explain why this is a tragedy, what's happening, which is kind of twofold. It's not just the way animals are suffering, but it's the fact that our legal system is a complete failure for protecting them, which is something that you'll hear often is like, oh, well, there's laws in place to protect them. And just as you would expect if you work in other animal issues, of course, it's a total failure. And then we'll discuss a little bit about why non-human animals are not effective models of human diseases. It's probably not too shocking, but we'll look at some of those specifics for folks who looks like a lot of people are interested in outreach or do outreach. So hopefully that will help you when you get those questions of, but people. And then we're going to transition to how we can actually help animals in labs and other animals by focusing on learning about pressure campaigns or strategic campaigns and kind of what that looks like, and some tools that hopefully you'll be able to utilize with your own communities. So let's jump right into it. Thanks for folks still adding in the chat what kind of activism you do or are interested in. I also want to say I can save this PowerPoint as a PDF and send it to anyone. So if it's hard for you to listen and be writing at the same time, I'll just send it to you. Some of them are pretty dense, and so I don't want you to feel like you have to write every word. I will just send this to anyone interested. And my email, make sure it's in the chat, but it's just amy@riseforanimals.org. So anyone who wants a copy of the PowerPoint, I will email it to you. Just send me an email and say PowerPoint, please, and I'll get it to you. So let's first discuss a little bit about how laws are failing animals in labs, because this is a really common thing I hear, is that, well, there's laws in place to protect these animals. You don't know what you're talking about. And it just could not be further from the truth. So, and it really demonstrates how animals are viewed and explains how much they're suffering when you look at the laws that are supposedly there to protect them. And the fact of the matter is there's actually only one law that does anything to protect any animals in laboratories in the United States. And this is called the Animal Welfare Act. It came around in the 60s because there was a lot of concern around animals in experiments during that time. So this was like a direct response to a lot of pressure from people concerned about animals in labs. But some of the key things to know about the Animal Welfare Act is that it really only sets these like really specific and incredibly weak standards related to the animal's housing and their handling and how they're fed and veterinary care. It doesn't affect the actual experiments happening to the animals. It's like the time outside of the experiments is what it's really focused on, is like their captivity. So there's literally there's no experiment that it prohibits. The Animal Welfare Act, you can do whatever you want to animals if you have like the proper sign-offs. It doesn't make any sort of experiment illegal, no matter how much pain it's causing the animal or how unnecessary it is. It doesn't affect that at all. And the other huge failure of the Animal Welfare Act that I think a lot of folks are shocked to learn about is that when it defines animals, there was actually an amendment to this act so that it redefined what an animal is. And when they redefined what an animal is, they specifically excluded the most common animals used in laboratories. So this is obviously mice, rats, also cold-blooded animals. There's a lot of zebrafish used in experiments. They don't have any protection under this act. Birds, cephalopods, like octopus, and then a lot of farmed animals if they're used in experiments specifically about improving agriculture, animal production methods. So all of these animals have no protection under the Animal Welfare Act. Laboratories literally don't even have to count them. They do not even have to report how many mice and rats they're using every year. So it's actually really hard for us to know the extent of the problem because there's no sort of reporting in place for the animals that are mostly used for these mice and rats. And yes, and I see folks talking about the IACUCs. The IACUCs are institutional animal care and use committees that are supposed to oversee the research happening in these laboratories. And that's part of what the Animal Welfare Act set up as well, is like, okay, but you have to ask your IACUC for permission before you start doing research. But there's so many problems. Rob here already mentioned one of them, is that they are super secretive. It's hard to know at a lot of places who's even sitting on these committees. So it's hard to even try to open up discussion with them to see why they're okay with, certain experiments happening. But more so than that, when there has been research, there's published papers about this, about who is sitting on these committees that are supposed to oversee, if something is, if an experiment is maybe too bad for the animal, or is just too traumatic, or is using too many animals and killing too many animals. The problem is that the IACUCs are almost all just other animal experimenters or people from within the institution. They're required to have one person who's not affiliated with the institution, but this one unaffiliated person is often like the CEO's bishop, or some veterinarian friend of the sitting vet, or they're rarely actually not affiliated in some way. They're certainly not animal rights people. And even if they were, the way these committees work is by majority vote. And so even if you have one person who cares about the animals, they just constantly are overrun. So lots we can talk about with why IACUCs suck, but just know there's really no good oversight in these labs. So I'd like to just show what we do know about how many animals are in labs. Like I said, we don't know mice and rats, birds, animals not protected, but there are a lot of species that do have to be accounted for in labs, and they have to be reported to the USDA every year, with a giant caveat that every time there have been kind of deep looks into, like, are they reporting the right numbers? It's usually too low and they're not reporting them all. So this is like a bare minimum. What the most recent numbers we have in the United States, this was nearly 1 million animals being used in experiments. And this is kind of the breakdown of species you see. NHP stands for non-human primate. And sorry, I should have warned, I will just have a couple graphic images today and one video, not too graphic, but a little graphic. But I think it's important to see, it's rare to get an inside look into what labs look like. They're very secretive. They literally don't have windows. Some of them are built underground. They don't want it to be known what they look like. And I think that makes it all the more important that we share what it looks like. The center photo is how mice and rats are kept in labs. They're kept in these shoe boxes, about 5 to a cage, and then they're just stacked floor to ceiling. I've talked with people who formerly worked in labs, and it's like every single day can be dozens of mice and rats dying. They're constantly just taking out dead animals. It's horrifying. And then the other photos you see here are from an investigation from my alma mater, University of Utah, except the beagle. The beagle was at a private facility, but these are all completely legal experiments happening to these animals. They have electrodes implanted in their heads. They have screws drilled into their skulls, like this monkey Frick has. They have skin experiments done to them, and they're all living in stainless steel boxes day in and day out. They're never getting outside these boxes. And so when we're trying to understand the scope of the problem, we know about 1 million animals being used that are counted by these facilities and reported to the USDA. But since so many of them are these non-protected animals, mice, rats, and birds, it's estimated that there's over 110 million animals being used in experiments every year in the United States alone. And so only 1% of them have any sort of protection under the AWA. And I think it's also important, and especially for folks doing outreach and that kind of tactic, some folks you talk about are more interested in like the financial responsibility and kind of government waste. A lot of people are concerned about, government wasteful spending in this country, rightly so. This is one of the biggest government wastes of completely for no good. $18 billion a year are spent on these animal experiments by the National Institutes of Health. And that is taxpayer money. National Institutes of Health is funded by taxpayers. This is our tax money, which is what makes it really hard. We are in some way kind of complicit in this happening against our will. Our money is being spent on this. So we have every right to be angry about it. I'm just going to briefly discuss the only other kind of so-called protection animals and labs get, and this is called the PHS policy. This is a policy that labs are supposed to follow if they're receiving federal dollars from the National Institutes of Health. So if they're receiving our tax dollars, they're supposed to also follow this policy in order to receive the funding. But it is, of course, not a law. It's just guidance, which is, of course, its own issue, and it doesn't have real meaningful repercussions. And so that's one of the biggest problems of the PHS policy. The one thing that's beneficial in my mind is that it does include rats and mice as animals. So I mean, at least it doesn't say rats and mice aren't animals, right? But it's still a total failure when it comes to meaningful protection of animals in labs. And I can't really explain this in a way other than looking at a specific example. So I just want to like highlight, we get, one of the things that Rise for Animals does is a lot of what's called Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests. So we are able to get public records from public institutions like the National Institutes of Health, like public universities, to learn about what is happening to animals in labs with our money, especially. And what we see time and again of like labs have to report if they violate this policy. They have to tell the agency in the NIH, which is called OLA, they have to report and say, we did this thing that was against PHS policy, like, here, please forgive us, essentially. And time and again, we see the same response from the National Institutes of Health that just, it's like a copy and paste sentence every time. It's like, we think you did the right thing, no further action needed. This is what happens every time. And I just want to take like a second to explain like one story so you can see the gravity of what happens to these animals and how nothing happens, no meaningful repercussions happen. So this is just like a really memorable record I read earlier this year from Louisiana State University. I don't think anyone was from Louisiana, but there's folks down kind of in that part of the country. This was a story about an experimenter who was supposed to do what's called a bone graft surgery on the hind leg of one of each of 10 mice. But the experimenter showed up late for work, didn't come in until the afternoon. And so he had to rush through to try to finish all of these surgeries on these 10 mice for this experiment. And it's just, it's really shocking all the things that went wrong here. The first thing was that instead of just doing the surgery on one of the hind legs of the mice, he did it on both of their hind legs. He just didn't read what he was supposed to do. He did it on both hind legs, which is not only twice the trauma and surgery for these mice, but it also made it so that they were immobilized, like they couldn't walk anymore to reach food and water because both of their hind legs had had this surgery done. It got worse from there. He was supposed to give them pain medication, which is not a legal requirement for all experiments, but he was supposed to, and he didn't, even though he was supposed to give them pain medicine. So they had this super traumatic surgery done on 2 legs with no pain medicine that they, you know, later when a veterinarian reviewed it, the veterinarian said that these mice were crippled and they were dragging their legs. Some of them couldn't even bend their legs. Really awful stuff. Got worse from there. It got late and the lights shut down. That's what, you know, labs are on, just like automatic lighting, and he didn't know how to turn them back on. So instead of finishing for the day, he just turned on his cell phone light to finish the surgeries, literally using the light of his cell phone, which, I mean, imagine if your surgeon did that. It's just unconscionable, right? So when the veterinarian of the lab came in the next day, predictably, he just saw a horror show. These stitches had burst open. They were getting infected from the bedding and the cages. One of them had already died. They had to, you know, euthanize others because they were in so much pain. And like, so many things went wrong. It's clearly this person should be held responsible, right? But Louisiana State University, their answer that then NIH said was the right one is to require this person to go through a couple trainings and maybe some more supervision for a little bit. There's no way this person should work with animals, right? It should be clear, like there should be even more serious repercussions, but this is the kind of repercussion we see time and again. It's always just like go through some trainings or have some extra supervision. Just completely, like, experimenters are not held accountable even when they do everything completely backwards and wrong. So that's a lot of bad news. I want to just throw out some helpful laws and policies before we transfer into other things. Like I mentioned, we use FOIA to learn about animals in labs. I'll talk more about that and how you can get the information we have and how we can help you get information using FOIA. There's also some great state laws that have been passed through the good work of mostly Beagle Freedom Project that tries to make it a requirement that these labs have to at least offer dogs and cats for adoption after they've been used, so they have at least a chance for a natural and meaningful life after they're used in these painful experiments. And then there's also a lot of dissection choice policies around in different universities. So I think a lot of folks know generally about how animals are suffering, but I want to just give a little bit more information about the ways animals are used in labs. A lot of people identify animal testing and think of like cosmetics, right? Cosmetic testing. That is, in this country, in the United States, the smallest fraction of how animals are actually used. Not very many animals are used in cosmetic testing anymore. The most common ways animals are used are basic research. This is using animals as models to try to understand just basic mechanisms of disease or basic biology. So it's not even focused on any sort of treatment yet. It's trying to understand like way before then, just basics. Then animals are also used in applied research, which is using them as models for drug or product toxicity. This is the kind of thing like the FDA requires for pharmaceuticals and vaccines and the sort. And then there's also non-required things of measuring toxicity for different chemicals, and cosmetics would fit into this applied research. Their bodies are also used as factories for monoclonal antibodies, and I've also seen them used as factories of like ticks. So they'll have rabbits or cats being kept so that they can have these ticks on them because they want to study something related to the ticks. Really awful stuff. And really, truly, a lot of why animals are in labs is just this basic like scientific curiosity. That's really what it boils down to for a lot. And the emphasis and need for people in research to be getting publications and to have published papers, that drives a lot of how many animals are used in labs. And when we talk about the ways that animals suffer, I mentioned the Animal Welfare Act governs a lot of like the housing of animals in labs. This is the kind of failure from the Animal Welfare Act when we're talking about these, supposed protections for animals in their housing. The image shown here is twice the size that is legally required under the Animal Welfare Act of a cage for dogs in labs. And there's this amendment in the Animal Welfare Act that if a dog is in a cage that's at least twice as big as required, which is this cage size, then those dogs do not have to be let out at any time for exercise. They say this is enough space for animals, for these dogs to be able to exercise on their own in this stainless steel cage. So dogs in labs are typically held like this in this size cage so that they never even have to let them out. Most dogs in labs never get outside. They never touch grass or the sun on their backs, nothing that's natural and important to them. And we created this graphic to show what it looks like. And this was my dog, Ellie. I still share her story, but she passed away last summer, but she was rescued from a laboratory. And this is how much size she had when she was in a lab. This was taken in my kitchen, but this is when she was in the lab, how much space she had. And she didn't get out of the lab until she was 8 years old. So if you can imagine what that might do to a dog's body, her muscles had completely atrophied by the time, she came to us when she was 8 years old. She had never been exercising, and so her muscles never had exercise and work. They weren't built up at all. So when we first adopted her, she couldn't even make it 2 doors down before she had to stop, and we would put her in her wagon to go around the rest of the block because her body was just not strong enough. She also, of course, was not potty trained at all because in a lab, they just go right where they are in the same stainless steel box. It's horribly traumatic what had happened to her, and you could tell from her body. Another thing, she wasn't even familiar with grass and was almost afraid of it. I really distinctly remember, and I remember crying the first time I took her to a dog park, because I thought, oh, she's gonna love this, like it's going to be this great freedom fest, like in the dog park with these other happy dogs. But we took her in and she just balanced on the cement where the fence was posted in, because she was still afraid of the grass. Grass was so foreign to her. She just balanced on the cement, the only surface she had ever been familiar with. Now, of course, she got better, and over time grew to love the grass and exploring. And but this is the kind of ways that the kind of damage done to these animals in labs. And the kinds of experiments happening, it's almost anything you can think of is happening, sadly, to animals in labs. I just recently, last week, sorry, a side tangent, I just last week saw this published paper of experimenters who are using monkeys to learn about why do humans like reality TV? Like literally they're restraining monkeys to make them watch footage that's the equivalent of like reality TV for monkeys versus like nature documentary for monkeys. It's like, there's like nothing that can surprise me anymore of how trivial and stupid these experiments are. But the ways that they are used, and I'm sorry again for these graphic images, this is an example of an experiment happening at Arizona State University, which did anyone join? I think maybe some folks from Arizona State or Phoenix were going to join today, but there's actually an active campaign by awesome grassroots folks on this issue. But these are the kinds of exceptions they got. So, like I said, the Animal Welfare Act is supposed to make it so that animals are getting regular food and water, at least, right? Like that's like one basic law they're supposed to follow. But if it's necessary or deemed necessary for the experiment that they not have access to food and water, all they have to do is tell the IACUC, we need to keep them hungry, we need to restrict their water. And that's what happened here and is happening at Arizona State University. This experimenter is withholding water all day for these monkeys so that when they put them in this restraint chair, like you see here, they will be what they call motivated to do the experiment, to follow orders of the experimenter so that they can get a drop of water at a time. Because experimenters all over the country have learned that primates, non-human primates, will do a lot of things just to be able to have access to water, just like any of us would. It's like a prime torture device. They also, in this experiment, are kept in this kind of restraint for up to 6 hours every day of the week. This is the kind of thing happening, and they have all these surgeries happening to them. This one is it's a neurological experiment trying to learn about movement and what part of the brain is triggering when your arm is moving. This is the kind of, like Patricia is mentioning here, like this is like the medieval torture devices being used in these labs, and it's absolutely completely barbaric, just as Patricia says. And if I can just like one pointed thing about all of this to really take home, and one of the biggest problems we face for animals in labs is that there is no such thing as an illegal experiment on animals in the United States. As long as you get IACUC approval, you can do whatever you want to these animals. It's even written into the Animal Welfare Act. This is the specific code. It's saying, nothing we're saying here is actually meant to determine what you're doing during the experiment, just the time outside of the experiment. So let's just briefly talk about, it's barbaric, it's horrible, there's immense suffering, but some people will still say, pretty much everybody gets this. Pretty much everyone looks at this and says, there's no doubt this is suffering, right? No doubt in people's mind, this is suffering. Some people just think, okay, but it's worth it though, because we have to find these cures. I've been impacted by cancer. I've been impacted by all these things. Like, how else are we going to learn about this? And the sad reality is that they're not good models for this either. The supposed good coming out of this is failing. And so I just want to talk through a few of these reasons why, and sorry, I'll try to go through a little bit quicker here. One of the main things we found, and this information I'm sharing in this section is all from either published papers or from the institutions that fund all this research themselves. This is not my numbers, okay? So this number is from the National Institutes of Health, who, like I mentioned earlier, fund a majority of the animal experiments happening for basic research. They found that 95% of drugs that appear safe and effective in animal models fail when they get to the human clinical trials. 95%, okay? Vast majority of drugs that look effective in animals are not effective in people. If that wasn't enough just for these drugs, like looking at just a few cases of failure, which honestly, if you're into research, you can go down a whole rabbit hole of published papers finding how many experiments like this have failed. A few that I like to point out, you know, a lot of people talk about the polio vaccine. It was obviously a really critical vaccine at the time, but it was long delayed because they were experimenting on monkeys first, and monkeys actually contract polio through their nose, but human primates contract it through the mouth. So the way they were trying to come up with a treatment was, they were never going to get there because monkeys contracted it in a completely different way than humans do. Another example that most people I think have a connection to is tobacco smoke. And now we all know, right, that tobacco smoke can lead to lung cancer. And there was actually for a long time epidemiological data showing this clear link between lung cancer and smoking tobacco cigarettes. But the regulatory authorities were denying it because it was being studied in animal models, and it's really difficult to reproduce this lung cancer in animals. So they were hooking up animals to lots of, you know, inhaling tobacco smoke, the equivalent of many packs a day, and they don't get lung cancer like humans do because they're not humans. Their bodies are different than ours. And then just lastly, another issue, even, you know, aside from when drugs fail when they get to humans, one of the other problems, it's hard to measure how many times that happens, but a lot of times there are effective pharmaceuticals and drugs and vaccines that we don't get to because they test in animals first and they're not effective in animals. So for penicillin, as example, it was on the shelves. This is the first effective antibiotic developed. And it was on the shelves for more than a decade because they tested it in rabbits first and there was no positive effect in rabbits. They essentially, you know, they peed it out. It didn't have any impact on them. And then just a couple quick things here. There's so many examples of this, it's hard to even pick and choose, but there's been systematic reviews looking at different science that's happened, different kinds of research happening. And those systematic reviews are really good ways for us to assess science. It's the most reliable kind of data, really, are these systematic reviews. And when they've done systematic reviews for treatments of strokes, we find that there's been more than 700 treatments effective in animal experiments for strokes. Of that, they've moved 150 to human clinical trials, but of them, none have been effective in humans. Same story for HIV vaccines. Over 85 effective vaccines for HIV in animal models, but none of them have been proven effective for human animals. And, you know, it's not even just systematic reviews. It's not just animal advocates saying this. Now people, even like this person, Dr. Klausner, he used to be the director of the National Cancer Institute, and he has come out and said, we've been curing cancer in mice for decades. I mean, literally dozens of times. We have dozens of cures for cancer in mice, but it just doesn't work in humans. Our biology completely different. So what are the alternatives? There's lots of alternatives here. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm also not a scientist, full disclosure. I'm a grassroots activist, but these are a lot of the alternatives that exist and have been really effective and continue to be developed even more effectively. Like organ-on-a-chip technology has just really been growing and being just incredible how much it is turning into really effective ways of doing a lot of this kinds of research. Also in vitro, of course, human clinical studies. All these drugs that go through animal models also have to go through human clinical studies. A lot of these things have already been in the works for a long time. All right, I'm going to breeze through because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A in the end. So I just want to mention just briefly some of the ways that Rise for Animals addresses this problem. We have a policy branch who is run by a couple of my colleagues. And if you're interested in kind of policy work, or which is, changing laws and introducing bills on Capitol Hill and that sort of thing, if that's your interest, that's not my forte. So I included my colleague Frances's email here, frances@riseforanimals.org, if you want to learn more about being involved in like a policy capacity. She's an incredible resource and really powerful if you want to get into lobbying and that sort of thing. The next thing, I'm going to add this to the chat, this resource, because everybody should be using it if you want to help animals in labs. Well, that didn't work as a link, but anyways, essentially arlo.riseforanimals.org. This is a new resource we've developed to help expose labs using animals. And you can see here, there's information on more than 2,000 laboratories in the United States. And I think we're up to more like 20,000 records now, or maybe even more. But anytime we're getting information about a lab, we are adding it to here. So if you are interested in learning more about Arizona State University, you can search for Arizona State University and you can see what kinds of animals are being used there. You can go through and read every record we have on them, all these different types of inspections, just so much information here. If you're interested in learning more about animals and labs in your community, we've put all the resources that exist into one way easier way to understand it than all the government websites. So arlo.riseforanimals.org if you want to learn more. We also, in addition to exposing these kinds of labs, we also do some investigations. And I am just going to share this brief video with you all because I think it'll be helpful when we start discussing pressure campaigns, as this is a campaign we currently have going. So actually, you know what? I probably didn't screen share the sound. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second so I can reshare so that you'll be able to hear the video, because I always forget to click that button. Just give me 1 second. Let's see, share sound. Okay, here we go. And there is a little bit of graphic video here as a warning. Uh-oh, that didn't work. There we go.
It's one of the largest dog breeders for the animal experimentation industry in the United States. 23,000 dogs held captive, also cats, mini pigs, guinea pigs, mice, and ferrets. This is Marshall Bioresources. Breeding animals for torture in laboratory experiments around the world. Private companies that force animals to ingest chemicals like pesticides to test toxicity. Universities that sever dogs' spinal nerves, cut off their tails, and implant electrodes on their bladders. It's part of an $18 billion industry that works hard to hide its abuse from you, erasing any trace of these animals, because if you know, you will care.
Okay. Oh, that's an old link. We used to be Neves and now we're Rise for Animals. Sorry. I forgot to change that video, but yeah, so we're going to discuss this campaign when we start talking pressure campaigns. This is our current campaign is against Marshall Bioresources, which, as Ellie, who you met earlier in my photos, Ellie was born at Marshall Bioresources, so that's part of why I have a particular vendetta for Marshall Bioresources. But this is the part of Rise that I'm involved with and that I love, because I get to work with folks like you. Our grassroots organizing area of the organization focuses on building people power through skill building, leadership development, and organizing. We support grassroots campaigns against animal experimentation across the US. So if you have a campaign you're working on to help animals in labs, or if you want to start one, please reach out to me. We have lots of ways that we can support you in doing so. And then lastly, we focus on leading strategic campaigns across the country of the global corporations like Marshall Bioresources. So I'm going to transition into discussion pressure campaigns for about 20 minutes, and then we'll leave time for Q&A. And I honestly, when I talk about campaigns, it's usually like a 2-day full workshop into strategic planning. So I really struggled with trying to wrap my brain around how to effectively give you all some information today. And so what I decided to do is just give a very basic introduction into pressure campaigns and leave you with some resources and activities for you to do with your own groups, and not do it here since it would take a lot of time. So hopefully this will be helpful for you all. And I want to reemphasize, if you are interested in leading these kinds of strategic campaigns and need more help, I facilitate campaign planning sessions. I can give you just like links to activities to do for campaign planning and learning more. Please reach out literally anytime, amy@riseforanimals.org. But when we talk about campaigns, I know some folks have had mentioned being involved in campaigns. Some people do more outreach or cubes and that sort of thing, or education-based things. So I'd like to kind of start with, like, why should we be doing strategic campaigns or pressure campaigns? And really the most beneficial thing about doing campaign work is that there is like real tangible change that can happen when you do campaigns. So, you know, it's really rewarding for me when I do outreach and can like change someone's mind on something, get someone to go vegan or get someone to start caring about animals in labs. But you can't really see the big picture of like, okay, but did we shut something down? Did we actually stop something rather than just change people's diets? Because, you know, when you look at the real information, sadly, the consumption of meat in this country and even dairy in this country is still going up, despite how many people we've all, you know, changed their mind into veganism. So how can we get that real change? Like what we really want to do is not get people to care or not get people to go vegan. The real change we want is less animals being hurt. So pressure campaign is a way to identify that. And sorry, my foster dog might be a little loud, I'm sorry. And I also really want to emphasize, I don't know if anyone had, I forgot to ask this, but a lot of folks in our movement and movements in general struggle with burnout. Might be a concept you've heard of. There's certainly a lot of things to do to try to prevent burnout, which includes self-care and community care. But one of the best things for me personally that I've discovered to help me prevent my own burnout since I started being an activist in 2005 is these focused campaigns. Because I can't tell you, like, when you are involved in a campaign and when you actually get a victory, like that will motivate you for years. When we stopped horse-drawn carriages, that still motivates me today. It was many years ago, but like that just is so motivating when you see like real change happen. That really can help with preventing burnout. So pressure campaigns, what's it all about? How do we do it? It's all about focusing in and strategy. So it's not just thinking, strategy is totally separate from like tactics, you know, like a protest is a tactic, a cube of truth is a tactic. You know, writing a letter to the editor is a tactic, but strategy is really kind of the overarching idea of how we're going to turn what we have into what we need in order to get what we want. That's kind of my definition of strategy. And really it's all about creating power or shifting power so that we're able to get to that goal. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but really to understand strategy and to understand what we need for our strategy, the first thing that's often overlooked is to take a step back and learn about who we're up against. You know, there's lots of like books written about, you know, like successful like wars and stuff that's all about like, you have to know your enemy, right? It's the same thing for us. We have to know what we're up against and we have to know what their weak links are. And one of the things I love looking at for learning about weak links is what our targets of our campaigns are saying are their weak links. So any of these companies who are publicly traded on NASDAQ or whatever for their stocks, they have to report to the SEC risk factors. So they have to say like, okay, like what are the risk factors of our company, so that people who are interested in investing in them are fully aware of what the risk factors are. And so I love this one I saw last year. The Charles River is a huge animal laboratory in the United States. And they mention as part of their risk factor that they are dependent on limited source of supply for large research models, which is in their non-human primates. And they're worried about disruptions to air travel or activist campaigns. So for me, this really emphasizes that campaigns can work and they are afraid of them, but also you can see here that, okay, it's really critical for their business that supply of non-human primates from other countries is not disrupted. So this is like a good potential for folks who might be interested in campaigning against Charles River. This is a risk factor for them. Important that we start knowing our enemy and start looking at what they say is their risk factor. So this is another example of risk factors. Part of our campaign against Marshall Bioresources is targeting Petco. And I'll tell you why. Petco sells Marshall Pet Products, which is owned by the same company as Marshall Bioresources. They create food for ferrets and toys for ferrets. It's mostly ferret and other small animals, but those products are sold in Petcos. So it's literally going into the same pockets of the people who run that factory farm of beagles that we showed from the video today. In addition to Marshall Pet Products, they also sadly sell ferrets that are born and bred at Marshall as well. So this is why Petco is part of our campaign. And so when I was looking, they recently actually started getting traded on NASDAQ, and this was part of their risk factor assessment, which is really focused on the fact that they are really dependent on the reputation that it has taken them years to build among their customers. And any bad publicity they're going to get could really impact their business. So this should be a good model and a good way for us to know, okay, they're afraid of bad publicity, right? Especially on social media, litigation, these kinds of things. So they know their weak link is if their reputation is damaged. So it is part of our job as a campaign against them to make sure we are targeting their reputation, because they know their weakest links better than we do. So listen to what they say. And so when we're talking about pressure campaigns, the first step is knowing your enemy, understanding what you're up against. But the next thing is figuring out that strategy, and kind of the best way I think to start really figuring out your strategy is to create what's called a theory of change. So, okay, sorry, I'll take a step back. So when we say your strategy, right, this is again separate from the tactics you choose, but it's how you think you're going to create this change. And you're identifying the goal of your campaign, what you think, and it's really important that the goal of your campaign, when you're doing a pressure campaign, any kind of campaign work, you believe you can achieve this goal. And it has to be a specific and tangible goal. Of course, I think most people here have a goal of animal liberation generally, right? Like that's a great goal. We all need to get there. But in order to get there, we need to like really focus back down, really start getting into like a more specific goal that we can achieve directly, that will get us to animal liberation. It's part of the path to animal liberation, but it's more specific and tangible than that. Okay. So creating a theory of change statement can really help guide how you're going to create change in a campaign you lead. And so I just want to give an example of this to illustrate it. So I think most people in the United States, everywhere, I know some people are not from the US, but one of the most read movements in our history is the civil rights movement. And so most folks here are probably familiar with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and Rosa Parks and kind of that part of the civil rights movement, which if we're writing out a theory of change for the Montgomery bus boycott, it would go if and then strategy is the Black community in Montgomery boycotts the bus system, then the bus company will desegregate the buses because the decrease in ridership will significantly impact their profits. So when we're thinking through our theory of change, the reason is what their interests are. What was the interest of the Montgomery bus system? Profits, right? Like they want to be profitable. So if the Black community who's sick of being forced to sit in the back of the buses stops taking the buses, and it took an incredible amount of work to be able to still get people to where they needed to go, and incredible organizing to make this happen, right? But that is what they identified was the best strategy, was to impact their profits. And so they did that by not paying to ride the bus, so that they would be able to desegregate the buses. So as you can imagine, or hopefully you know, that wasn't the goal of the civil rights movement, was not just generally to start to just desegregate the bus. That's not the end goal. That was a small goal on the way to the bigger goals, right? And so that's something that I've had trouble with in the past, is coming up with those specific goals that are still on the path to animal liberation, but it's like a really critical thing when we're talking about campaign work. So let's talk about these goals and what they should be when you're thinking through like how you're going to create your own pressure campaign or ramp up a campaign you have. This is like the easiest way for me to visualize for visual learners, is to think of like your top goal. Maybe it's to your mountaintop goal might be to shut down the Emory University National Primate Research Center. There's some folks here that are working on that campaign. That's like your mountaintop goal, is shutting down the primate lab at Emory, right? But how are you going to get there? It's typically, it's not just like one overnight thing, it shuts down. You're gonna have to set smaller goals to get there so that you can see if you're getting measurable goals there. You're going to need, you're going to have to pool together your resources, which can be your time, the people, the relationships you have, maybe your money, to get to those goals. So, and that's called a nested goal. So maybe, just for example, I mean, this could be, again, like a full day workshop, but maybe some of those nested goals are getting some alumni to pull funding until they shut down the Primate Research Center. Maybe you recognize the financial motivation of universities. So you're trying to set smaller goals that focus on the financial incentives of the university, which might be getting people to pull their donations, getting people to, a set number of people to sign that they refuse to give to their alma mater until they shut down the research center, that sort of thing. But you need to be always focusing on measurable goals that are getting you there, and focus on really building capacity of the movement and bringing in more people to the movement. Okay, so I only have a few minutes before I want to leave time for Q&A, which I know this is kind of like a tease and like probably hardly making sense for pressure campaigns. There's just so much that can happen to discuss pressure campaigns, but I want to leave you with one more tool that has been one of the most effective ones for me as I try to wrap my brain around pressure campaigns, and I'll give you an example for the Marshall Bioresources campaign. And that's the concept called spectrum of allies, which I don't know if folks have heard of this before. It's something I had unknowingly kind of knew about or was like using in my own campaign planning work, but I didn't know there was like this real thing that exists in movement building. And it's really helped me actually wrap my brain around trying to identify what tactics we need to utilize when we're creating our strategies. And the essential idea of spectrum of allies is this really kind of optimistic fact that most successful movements do not get like the people you're targeting, like your active opponents, people who are fighting what you're trying to get. Your active opponent would be, like the National Primate Research Center or the experimenters at the National Primate Research Center. movements don't win by getting those people to become animal rights activists. Like, you do not have to get your active opponents to be your complete allies to win. Generally, actually, all it takes is just getting enough people to move one pie slice to the left in this spectrum of allies. So it's a matter of getting, you know, the active allies are you and your local group and maybe other people who are helping you. What you need to do is get enough people shifting. So your passive allies, think of like who agree with you, who agree fundamentally with the campaign you have. They're just not helping you yet. If you can get enough people transitioning from there to actually being helpful, you're a huge step closer to winning. And just every one of these pie slices needs to shift a little bit. And so your active opponents need to become passive opponents. At least some of them do. So they're not actively fighting you anymore. They're not showing up and counter protesting. They're not going to media and being like actively against you. They're still against you. They're just passive about it. They're not taking action against the campaign you're working on. You're just moving these one slice to the left. This is an activity that I really recommend you do with your local group. And you can, if you Google Spectrum of Allies, there's great facilitation resources to help you get there. Or you're welcome to reach out to me at any time if you want help facilitating or if you want an outside facilitator. But it's just so valuable because you'll find there's actually a lot of targets that you can go to. It's not, you don't just have to be against your active opponent. You don't just like, you know, for the Marshall Bioresources campaign, let's use this as an example briefly to illustrate, you know, like our active opponent right now is Marshall Bioresources, right? They have an absolute incentive not to go out of business. They do not want to go out of business. And that's what we want. There's just no way that we want them to keep breeding animals for research. If they want to keep having Marshall pet products and selling animal food and toys or whatever, like that's, you know, from my perspective, that's totally like fine. I just want them to stop breeding tens of thousands of animals for cruel experiments, right? That's the active opponent. I don't anticipate them ever being animal rights activists, right? But hopefully we can get them to at least not be actively opposing us, which they probably will always be actively active opponents because it's literally their business, right? But there's a lot of other targets. We don't just have to go after when we're thinking through our strategy and our tactics. We don't have to focus all of our energy on Marshall Bioresources, which is in this super like rural small community in upstate New York where it's freezing most of the year. And, you know, the local community is just not going to be as sympathetic probably because they invest a lot in the community. You know, the one park in the city is, you know, Marshall Park. You're just really limiting your campaign if you only focus on like the perpetrator of the problem. So instead you have to think of, okay, what else are they interested in, or what else is propping them up? What else do they need to keep being successful? And that's why we branched out and have started campaigning against places like Petco, because Petco is giving Marshall a ton of money through all the ferrets they buy, through all the Marshall pet products they're selling. So this is a type of opponent who, you know, I firmly believe is more likely to be able to win over, because they don't have to go out of business to do a lot of damage to Marshall. We're not asking Petco to go out of business. We're simply asking them to stop selling this one type of product that, you know, alternatives exist. There's other ferret food out there, and to not sell ferrets, which they've already stopped selling so many animals that it is really just the next logical step for them as a company trying to be more progressive in animal issues more and more every year. Still have a long way to go, but they're getting a lot better. They even recently stopped selling shock collars and are trying to, you know, promote that. So if we can get enough, so it just really, when you start thinking through and start looking at a spectrum of allies, you start seeing there's a lot of people you can tap into. That's not just your opponent. You know, it's important to look at like your passive allies, which if you're working on animals used for food issues, I know as activists, one of like our most frustrating things are those vegan Facebook groups that are full of people who just talk about their food and not about helping animals, right? And it's so frustrating when we treat them kind of crummy, to be honest, because it's hard not to be judgmental sometimes, but they are our passive allies, and we can't use the same tactics that we would against our opponents as our passive allies. Like, they agree with us. We don't need to be, you know, treating them in the same way. We need to recognize that they are the most likely to be able to come over and be our active allies in this. So we have to use different tactics, and it's important not to ignore them and just say, you know, oh, those people suck. We need to try to bring them in. What can we do to bring them in to make them our active allies? What kinds of tactics can we utilize to make these folks who agree with us? We don't have to convince them to agree. We just have to convince them that they have the power to do something, and they need to join us in doing something so we can harness people power together. So this is, it's a really helpful tool. I really recommend looking into this as you start developing your campaigns, because this is where you'll be able to identify your places of pressure and who is propping up the places that you're up against, and how we can just shift them just one pie slice to the left. That's how we win. It's just getting enough people moving in one slice to the left here, which hopefully makes folks feel a little bit more optimistic about the ability to create change, because we don't have to get, you know, these horrible companies to become, you know, great proponents of animal rights. We just need to get them just one step to the left, just all of these folks one step to the left. So I want to leave time for Q&A. I think I have, for folks who get the PDF, these are links of resources I highly recommend utilizing. I'll put them in the chat too, because some people may not get the PDF. So let me just send this in the chat. The one I recommend the most for folks interested in strategic campaigns and pressure campaigns is the second one, People Power Change. There's so many useful tools here for really thinking through an effective campaign strategy. It's really well done. It's through the incredible work of Marshall Gans, who is a great change maker in other social movements. So just a lot you can learn there. And some other good films and videos down here, especially it's Black History Month. It'd be a great time to watch the Eyes on the Prize series about the civil rights movement. And then this other online webinar series is another really great tool as you start learning about strategic campaigns and pressure campaigns. So I'm gonna stop here and leave, I think we have about 20 minutes left for Q&A, either about animal testing or campaigns. I'm happy to answer. I'll stop sharing my screen here so that we can join in. And Peyton, I don't know how y'all usually do it. I'm open to people. I'll defer to you if you prefer people ask questions in the chat, or how you prefer to do it at AAM.
So first off, I just want to say thank you so much, Amy, for that absolutely fabulous presentation. I have like pages and pages of notes, learned so much. Yeah, so that was great. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom. We are going to move into a Q&A portion. There were a couple questions asked earlier on in the chat that I'll ask, but if anybody has any questions, definitely don't be afraid to unmute yourself, ask Amy or any one of us to answer. I do want to say real quick, we talked about how effective pressure campaigns are, and I really want to reiterate that. At the beginning of the workshop, everybody said, or some people said, the types of activism that they're passionate about, that they are working on and have been doing for a long time. And I just want to say that doing pressure campaigns doesn't mean that you can no longer do those forms of outreach. You can still do those types of outreach that you're skilled at, that you have passion for. You can still do disruptions and outreach and protests and marches, but they just become that much more effective when they're part of a larger pressure campaign. So it's just that many more activists working towards one goal, you know, all across the world, the United States. If you know, you can still do what you love and what you already do. Just joining forces with other activists so far away can just really make things that much more impactful for the animals, which is really all of our goals as animal rights activists. We just want to do what's effective for the animals. So I just wanted to make that clear. So with that, we are moving into the Q&A portion. So I think Jeanette just said in the chat that she had a question. So you can either unmute yourself and ask or just type it out in the chat and we'll read it.
Oh, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so when ex-President Trump first got elected, he took down all the information about what's going on in the labs that used to be on a website,
Mhm.
a government website. Now I'm wondering if you think that there's a way to get Biden to put that back up, or should we pressure him? I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jeanette. It actually did go back up, even actually during Trump's administration. They had to put it back up. This was,
I didn't know.
yeah. So it's reports on the USDA's website. So it did go back up, but that's also why we created the resource we did, Arlo, because of it's just like too scary, the potential of how fast this information can be taken down. So we save absolutely everything that's posted on there so that in the event it's taken down again, it doesn't disappear,
That's
because
great.
it's, yeah, huge problem. And you know, there's,
So what's your site, Arlo? What's that?
yeah, it's arlo.riseforanimals.org. And that's where you'll find the information and records we've received about all these animal labs across the country.
Does it help to get anything changed?
Well, I mean, I think it's good to stay informed, and when you're like interested on kind of this like a political level thing. One of the other still concerning things about the USDA, who oversees the Animal Welfare Act, that we've seen, like administration to administration, it does change the way that they issue violations and repercussions for labs. And during the previous administration, the number of violations dramatically dropped of labs. And it's not because these labs suddenly got all the more better. It's because they started saying, hey, just like hush hush on these, don't write up these violations, don't issue fines, like the fines labs get, and puppy mills, like all the kinds of awful places the USDA oversees. Those fines have gone way down in the last 4 years. So, you know, if you're interested in kind of political campaigns or pressuring the Biden administration, I think they really need to build back more meaningful repercussions and more meaningful oversight from the USDA. That's certainly within their periphery and in their role. And it does make a difference. You know, these fines are kind of junk change for these labs, to be honest, but it's really damaging for their reputation. And that's something that activists have often used to their benefit, to be able to show, you know, all the awful things they've done. And so when those awful things aren't being documented, it's a lot harder for our work. So that's certainly something we can be pressuring the Biden administration to do, is to improve the oversight by the USDA for laboratories, as well as puppy mills and zoos and the other places they're supposed to oversee.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I saw a couple questions in the chat, so I'll address some of those. Trey asked, what are some of the most successful tactics as part of a larger strategy that you've seen work in order to achieve change for animals? It's a really good question, Trey. I think one of the most important things to me to focus on is that, kind of like you're saying, you know, you have to be part of a strategy, but so often as activists, we're kind of reactionary, and we don't think through a strategy. Like, that's what we tend to do, is we just tend to do tactics. We just say, something's got to be done, I'm going to go protest. And then you just kind of fade away, and then you get, you know, something else terrible happens somewhere else. And so you say, oh my gosh, this is terrible, I'm going to write a letter to this place. And we're just kind of all over the place and just using tactics willy-nilly for other places and not seeing how it's part of a strategy. So the most important thing to me is, you know, I think all these tactics are important and valid and fit in somewhere, but you have to be able to see that it's part of your strategy, and to really think through what you want your strategy to be and how you're going to build momentum over time. It's another really important part of campaigning is, you don't want to start a campaign with your biggest, most bold move ever, the serious lockdown and everyone getting arrested, because then it's like, where do you go from there? Like, you only go downhill from there. So it's like, you want your target to be like, oh no, what are they going to do next? Like, because you keep building momentum, you're doing something like every month and it's like, where did they go from here? That's what I have found to be generally most effective. I think there's all kinds of successful tactics. It's just a matter of seeing how it's part of a strategy and learning from them, always being reflective. But there's another resource. Shoot, I didn't include it on this list. Maybe it's linked in one of the resources I did, but there's a worksheet called 198 Tactics for Social Change or something. And it's kind of fun to look at that, or actually beautifulrising.org. They have really good resources on strategy as well as tactics to try to get outside of the bubble and start thinking creatively. I think that's really important too. But yeah, I think all sorts of tactics have been effective in our movement and other movements as well. Okay, I know, sorry. Oh, coronavirus testing. How do we convince the masses that yes, vaccines are needed and no, don't test on animals? This is such a timely question. So thanks for asking that. I think when we're, especially for COVID vaccine, something I like to point out is the fact that because we needed this vaccine so quickly, they were actually running the human clinical tests at the same time as the animal experiments. Which is one thing they're allowed to do. They still have to be doing the animal tests, unfortunately, by FDA requirements. But if it's like desperate enough, they can do the human clinical studies at the same time, which should, kind of invalidate the animal models. Like, we didn't need it to be doing the clinical trials, right? If it's needed fast enough, we can just go straight to human clinical trials. So that's one thing I like to point out. Two other things with the COVID vaccine. Even after we had 2 vaccines that were had passed human clinical trials, there were primate labs all around the country saying, we don't have enough monkeys to be able to develop a vaccine, and we need more monkeys and more money. And it should just be clear, like, there was already vaccines that had passed the animal models. These places are just fundamentally most interested in their bottom line and in money, and trying to utilize this crisis for their own financial benefit, and that should demonstrate that. And then lastly, the FDA started requiring animal tests for vaccines and pharmaceuticals. I believe it was in the 60s. And I think it's just interesting to point out, like, when that became a requirement, when we legally had to start testing pharmaceuticals and vaccines on animals, it was literally before the fax machine, like before fax machines were widely used. And think it like now, our technology has advanced so much. No one, like, I don't know, some of you might not even know what fax machines are at this point. Like, it's a totally obsolete technology. We've had several before then, or, like since then. And to think like, oh, but we still have to be doing this animal model. We haven't created any better technology yet. It's an obvious farce. It's obviously outdated in medieval. And so I think that's good to point out as well, to think like, no, we are better than this. Like, our scientists are better than this. They have advanced, and there's all these alternatives that exist to replace this.
Debbie asked a question. She said, I live in San Diego and there are tons of biotech companies. I know UCSD has primates. How do I use the Freedom of Information Act to get more information?
That's a really good question, Debbie. I definitely recommend checking out our Arlo database to get some of the basics about those places. And you can search by location. So you can search by San Diego to see what labs are there and what information we already have. Sadly, like, biotech companies are private companies, and so it's harder. You can't do public records requests to them directly like you can to public universities, but you can still submit FOIA requests to agencies that oversee it. So like the USDA, APHIS is what it's called. And then you can also, if they're getting NIH funding, you can do a Freedom of Information Act request to the entity that oversees the NIH, which is called OLA. So you can learn any violations they've reported and that sort of thing. So we do a whole workshop on FOIA requests. And so I recommend checking out Arlo, Debbie. And then if there's information you still want to learn, reach out to us. I think we also have some general tools on Arlo to learn, like if labs are subject to public records laws, and you can kind of get a start there. But then if you are still looking for more information, reach out, and we have some like form letters and actually like the ones you could do for a biotech company. They have like pretty easy to use forms on their website now, like the National Institutes of Health. They have like a form you just say, like, you just fill in the gaps, and we're happy to help you get there if you need help after looking through the Arlo database. Yeah.
So I did see another question earlier in the chat that mentioned, you know, on like toiletries and cosmetics, sometimes there'll be like vegan, like not tested on animal, different logos. Which, if I've understood this question right, which of those stickers, if like with your expertise, do you think are the ones that we should look for? Because there's so many different ones. Do they all have different like requirements? What would be like the sticker or the logo, vegan, cruelty-free, you know, that you would suggest people look to find?
Yeah, I think the Leaping Bunny logo is a good one that is verified through a few different nonprofits. So that's my favorite one. Beagle Freedom Project also created an app you can use called the Cruelty Cutter, and you just like scan a barcode. So it's called Cruelty Cutter, and that will tell you information and if it's cruelty free or not. So that's a great one. Yeah, in general, generic products aren't tested on animals. So I often, if like when in doubt, I usually get like a generic product. I also like Lush is completely cruelty free and vehemently anti-animal testing. So as much as I can, I try to get my products from Lush. They've also done, I should have shown a photo of it, but they did this really cool thing. I think it was in like a UK place one time, but they did a window display and they reenacted with humans. They did kind of like a staging of animal experiments, and they shaved this woman's head and like acted like they were implanting electrodes, like super powerful visual. So yeah, I don't work for them, but I just like, it's cool to see a company that is like so outwardly against animal testing. And PETA's list is also, I think PETA's list is legitimate, and they do a lot more work with companies to try to get them to stop testing on cosmetics than we do. And one of the interesting things is that even like these companies who still are testing, it's pretty much all because it's a requirement in China. So they're testing for the products sold in China. But even these giant companies, I'm told from people who work with them, they want to stop too. They don't want to have to do the animal testing either for cosmetics. Like they're like, yeah, we don't want to have to do this. We're just required to sell in China. And you know, while I wish they were all like Lush and just say we won't sell in China then, you know, I think there's like, I think it's like almost a victory in the movement. I think like we've gotten so far on cosmetics, and I think we'll see the end of animal testing for cosmetics like very soon. It's almost here already in this country, which is great. Oh, and Debbie, I just saw your question. Please reach out to me because yes, Petco has their headquarters in San Diego, and we are planning an event there. So we would love to have you be part of that. Anyone who's interested in joining the Marshall campaign, since there are Petcos across the country, you have a target in your community if you live in a city in the US. And we know of more than 100 labs who are buying animals from Marshall who are also targets of the campaign. So if you're interested in being involved in that campaign, please reach out. We are planning a National Day of Action on World Day for Animals and Labs, which is April 24th, I believe. Yeah, April 24th. So we're trying to get as many Petco protests around the country as we can on that day. So if you're interested in organizing or participating in one of those, like we'd love to have you. It'll be, you know, a national day where people all over the country can work together for animals and labs.
So quick question about April 24th. Do you suggest that whom should I reach out to? I'm in Atlanta.
Oh, great.
Atlanta folks, or how should I go about it?
Is Dana still here? I think Dana is organizing lots of awesome stuff for the campaign.
I'm here. Sorry, I was doing dish stuff. Yeah, you can. Do you have Facebook? Or
Okay.
you can email me. I can give my email is danaIsObsessedWithCats@gmail.com.
Okay.
I know it's old, but I am obsessed with cats. Yeah, if you want to email me, I would love, 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 love to have you come. And we're actually doing something. Let me look at my calendar. It's in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, Feb 27th, right? I'll be there.
Yes, it is. Okay, yeah. Actually, you already said you were going to go on Facebook, right? Did you?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
I thought I signed up, but I will if I haven't.
Okay, I think you might have. Some people, I have a lot of maybes, so I would really, because a lot of people are nearish here too. I would love if people came and helped out with that. So we're going to do it on February 27th, and I think we're going to do a couple kind of like practice runs, but still just to, get experience. And then on April 24th is the big National Day of Action. But yeah, that would be awesome. So yes.
Yeah, we are friends on Facebook, so I'll reach you out.
Yeah, I think you might have followed. Yeah. So, okay, cool.
Thank you.
I'm also going to add, since a couple folks said they're interested in participating in the Marshall campaign. Oh, that worked weird. But I just posted a link. This is to, if anyone uses, there's a resource called Slack. It's an app you can have on your phone or computer. And this is one we have for RISE activists, so we can work together on this campaign against Marshall. And if you have other campaigns you want people who are activists for animals and labs to know about, you're welcome to add it here. So just if you're interested to check it out, you can click that link. It's just a communication space for people working on issues for animals and labs. So you're welcome to join us there.
I think somebody else said they had a question. Maybe Andrea up in the chat.
Oh, it was about the FOIA, so it got answered. Thank you, though.
Yeah, definitely reach out if you have trouble with FOIA. It's kind of its own, yeah, it's a little complicated, but we have someone on our team who's like a FOIA expert. So anything that like is stumping you or is hard, we'll get him on the case. He's really good.
Hi, Amy. This is Prashant from Atlanta. First of all, thank you so much for the session. It's really great learning all this new information. So my question is about the alternatives that you kind of went over during the session. So if I understand it right, there are at least like more than six alternatives that you have walked us over, or that you have showed us. I am failing to understand what is the delay, for all these institutions to adapt to these changes. Why are they still going after the animals, even after such a failure rate? Like, they're all research scientists, right? So if they see 95% failure rate, they should change at some point. But there is some kind of a gap, either from our side or from their side. So I'm still failing to understand why is that number not changing their processes.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and you asked it really powerfully. So thank you so much for asking it. There's a couple things, it's hard for me to understand too. And I think almost every day I'm like, how is this still happening? Like they're just acknowledging how much failure is here. And there's, I think like a couple main things that contribute to it. I think the first thing, sadly, it's just like inertia, and it's like, this is the way we've always done things. And like, we're like hesitant to change. And especially like as individuals, we can be hesitant to change. If you do activism, you see this, right? And so if you have been, trying to cure cancer by infecting mice, and giving mice tumors for 25 years, it's going to be hard for you to admit that that has all been for nothing. You've been hurting and killing all these animals for nothing. Like, I think people are like, want to believe they just aren't there yet, and they just haven't figured it out yet. And they don't want to think all these years have been a waste and all these lives have been a waste. I think it's like a hard thing for people to acknowledge and to reflect that deeply and recognize how your career has been a failure. Like, it's like a really troubling thing to have to do, understandably. But so there's just kind of like the inertia, and as Star mentioned, money. There's so much money involved in animal experiments through through these grants. And related to that is that the people who are giving the grants and who are approving grants, who are reviewing grant applications, they are vivisectors. Like, they are people who in their career have been experimenting on animals as well. And so as long as the people making the decisions of who gets the money, if they, they want to think that their way is the best way, they all have egos like we all do. And so they are rewarding people who they think are doing the right model, which is their model. And so it's just this terrible feedback loop. And hopefully, once there's enough people, and there's great groups like Center for Contemporary Sciences as a spinoff org that we helped set up. That's all about utilizing good science and really getting these alternatives into places and making it so people understand how to use these alternatives and like building the knowledge around these alternatives. So I'm a lot more hopeful now that we have those kinds of organizations helping to expose the problems of the animal model from a scientific standpoint, not just an ethical one, and investing in the alternatives. Hopefully we'll start seeing that shift, but it's really troubling, especially, if they're supposed to be scientists, that they still just keep funneling money and time and wasted effort while we need these cures. That's the other sad part of it. Millions of animals needlessly having to die while we still don't have a cure for all these things because we keep investing just billions and billions of dollars into a model that's just failing time and again. So hopefully it starts changing, but it's kind of a sad reality that they just haven't started that shift yet.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks for the answer. 95% failure rate for any scientist is, kind of pretty bad. So I think they should, like you said, they should probably refocus on their research efforts and probably allocate or reallocate money from lab testing to, those alternatives that you have mentioned. And maybe it is a worthwhile effort, from our end to identify who to reach out to or, to do anything on this side. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's something that our policy team works on, is trying to change congressional language and in budget, especially in budget stuff for NIH, to really try to emphasize allocating more budget for those alternatives. So definitely, like, you can sign up for our newsletter on your website and for action alerts, and anytime they have potential bill language, if they need people to contact their reps, you'll get notified about that. So
cool, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so in the interest of time, I just want to do maybe a couple more questions. The first one is, how do we get the PDF? Do you want us to reach out to you, or how would we do that?
Yeah, I know. So I think since I don't have it saved right now to throw in the chat, I'll save it. And if you want to just email me, just say you want the PDF, amy@riseforanimals.org, or you can find me on Facebook on the event page. I'm listed as going or whatever. You can find me on Facebook. However is easiest for you all to find me, it's fine. Or if you join the Slack group, I'll post it in there as well.
All right, great, thank you. And then the last question I want to say is something that Trey said. Do you have any tips for choosing a target? Like a target for,
Yeah, okay. It's a really, I debated getting into this, but it's like a whole activity. But one thing I recommend doing, there's an activity I would recommend doing with your group, Trey, called power mapping. I'm happy to send you some resources about it, but that will really help you figure out who to target. So if you know you want a campaign, if you know your goal is to, for instance, shut down the primate research center at Emory, there's some research and power mapping we can do to figure out okay, who has power to make these changes? And you start seeing okay, well, who's going to be more sympathetic to us, because that might be the best places to start. So if you identify potential targets who have power over the university as some of their donors or their students or their alumni, you can really start looking at those as targets. But yeah, it's a great tool called power mapping. It would take a while to really utilize it, but that if you Google it, there's lots of resources that exist to teach you about it, or I'm happy to come back and lead a power mapping activity with your group sometime or send you resources on it.
So I think those are all the questions that we have time for. If you guys have any other questions, please definitely reach out to Amy we put her email a couple times in the chat, amy@riseforanimals.org. You can reach out to any of us at AAM. And just a reminder for everybody, this workshop was brought to you by the Animal Activism Mentorship. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at animalactivismmentorship.com. You can find us on the web at animalactivismmentorship.com. This workshop is also going to be recorded. Well, it is recorded and it's going to be put on YouTube under the channel Animal Liberation Action Squad. So you can rewatch it, get all the information a second time, absorb some new information that you missed the first time. Mikey's putting some links in the chat for you guys so you can get connected with us. If you want to get paired up with a mentor, it's completely free. Just visit animalactivismmentorship.com. And thank you guys so much for joining us and learning with us today. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to come and just share your wealth of knowledge and information with us. So we hope to see you all at more AAM workshops. That's all the time we have for today, but thank you all for the engagement and the participation. So yeah, we'll see you guys later.
Yeah, thank you all. And thanks for spending your time to build your skills and information. And yeah, huge thanks to AAM for doing this. This is one of the best things we can do for the movement is build our collective skills and start working together. So huge props to AAM for all they're doing.